Hi everyone, so this is the 8th episode of Collective Utopia, and before I start to read the next chapter, I just wanted to tell you that I just started my Substack blog, where you can read all the episodes in written form. For some people it's easier to follow the content and also to maybe to get engaged and write some comments. So you can find me on Substack, leonhardbartusek.substack.com. And for now, I just jump into the episode of October the 9th, 2021. The mechanics of power. Today, the bay shows a relaxed, almost windless atmosphere. Half of the sky is cloudless. Towards the east, where the sun rises, there are loose clouds that sometimes obscure the sun and sometimes let it shine through. The sea is calm and still, as a result of the rains and influxes of fresh water over the land. These different layers of color in turquoise show up, however, no longer so clearly delineated from each other, but in layers and streaks on the water surface. It is interesting to observe which wave movements run through the sea. The top layer of smallest waves, perhaps driven by a light imperceptible breeze, moves towards me in the direction of the coast. Normally directed towards it, that is, at an angle of 90 degrees, and in the direction of the east, larger waves push themselves. And parallel to this, superimposing these waves, large phases of flat waves with wave values up to 200 meters long show up. Superimpositions of realities and undercurrents to complex phenomena. Also the mechanics of power, which has determined mankind since time immemorial, cannot be so easily grasped and shortened to a formula. There are certain conditions and preconditions that overlap and in part run counter to each other. This mechanics, which most of us also only look at from the outside, is difficult for us to disentangle and to understand. If we stand outside and are powerless observers in the true sense of the word, we can only observe the surface and try to understand the whole dynamic, abstracting from it. But if we are in the middle of it, we no longer have any distance, no overview, and are imperceptibly driven by different wave movements and caught by currents of which we can hardly be master. Probably shortening, but in essence it should be noted, the striving for power, for influence on others, for effective power or also symbolic power is first and foremost an expression of a lack of self-worth. I want or need to fill this inner lack with recognition from the outside. It is important to understand that if I am given by this being, I can never really contribute to others. I'm only concerned with myself, and I use my ideas, my ideology, my religion, my promise of salvation, my art or my displayed intelligence or extraordinary achievements to gain this recognition or admiration from others. At the same time, I don't care about these others. It's all about me, about my self-aggrandizement. In our ego culture, it is almost a matter of course and something almost commonplace that people strive for success and fame. Thanks to some platforms on the internet, it's no longer just a few who strive to become pop stars, but millions of kids now want to become famous and influencers full time and get recognition through likes. Is that normal? Striving to be admired by people you don't know at all, with whom you have no relationship at all, is not normal at all, but pathological. Of course, as social beings embedded in communities, we want to be recognized and valued by the members of these communities. After all, a healthy community is about relationships, and it is desirable for everyone that the other person relates to me positively with esteem and respect. This form of recognition is, so to speak, the lubricating oil of good, even loose relationships from person to person. But this excessive desire for admiration is pathological and insatiable. This striving for success, admiration, and recognition, and consequently for political power or effective power, can never get enough. The recognition satisfying my self-image always acts only as a temporary kick to inflate my lack of self-worth in the short term. For a short time, I feel self-confident and valuable in the face of this admiration. However, this admiration is always something fleeting. Once I'm alone again in the hotel room, it slips away and I'm thrown back to my inner emptiness and the piercing pain of my self-doubt. Some pop stars have described this alternating dynamic between the mass euphoria on stage and the loneliness afterwards in the hotel room very well. It is very obvious to cover up this pain, for example, with the help of drug consumption. But it must also be said that where there is a transmitter, there is also a receiver. The readiness of the masses to admire and adore a pop star, a celebrity, a political leader, or a spiritual guru arises from the same source, namely a lack of self-esteem. Only it reveals the more common trait of strong conformity and the inadequacy, mostly developed in early childhood, of expressing oneself and showing oneself. Our traditional educational system in family and school are virtually designed to break the self-worth and individual expressiveness of the individual. After all, our system needs submissive civil servants and employees, not sovereign, self-determined members of truly democratic society. And so rather or strongly inhibited people admire the displayed extreme individual narcissistic self-expression of the so-called stars, want to participate in this euphoria and enjoy the moment to merge into the mass. Again, this phenomenon has become normality for us through the everyday consumption of media. We lose sight and feeling for the underlying psychodynamics, which is anything but normal, but sick. One should not forget that it is precisely this psychodynamic that explains the core of the Hitler phenomenon, nothing else. In the case of the pseudo-religious mass hysteria and the ideology that Hitler fired with it, the toxic and destructive mixture was given in the fact that in this case, the gasoline to fuel the euphoria was the celebration of an unleashed hatred. Fortunately, this is not usually the case today in this form and to this extent, but the basic conditions of narcissistic self-exaltation on the one hand and mass subjugation on the other are the same today with our celebrity cult. It must also be said that the historical conditions at the time of the rise of National Socialism, were special and favored this excessive hatred, which then led to the catastrophe. However, it cannot be ruled out in any way that the same or similar conditions might not come again. However, even if we look only at today, this dance around the golden calf is a serious problem and a dangerous aberration. This heated and fast-moving pursuit of fame is played out to us daily in the realm of entertainment, sports, and politics, and is an important factor in stabilizing the status quo. And as I'm trying to point out, the status quo is consolidated by a destructive system that is in the process of destroying all of our livelihoods. What greater crime against humanity could there be? What will our Nuremberg trials look like when it comes to finding and holding accountable those responsible for the ecocide that is being knowingly promoted? Then probably some of the actors will no longer be alive, but perhaps large corporations will sit in the dock instead. These have obtained the status of legal persons themselves. Our grandchildren's generation will then probably not point proudly to the group photo of Davos to highlight granddad in the second row. To shed some more light on the spiritual dimension of this phenomenon, the core problem is the lack of self-worth. It is as simple as that. It is less easy to recognize this in oneself, and it becomes even more difficult when it comes to really healing this lack in the soul. This is a life task and a process. To tackle this process can be a very satisfying work on the self. Again, this work can only be aspired to and done individually by each person, although often supported by professional help. There can be no universal instruction manual for this. Some people do trauma therapy. Many people find such instruction manual for life in the Bible. However, each should go her own way. Search, read, understand, ask, keeping asking, keep searching, etc. All this means meaning work, living a meaningful and valuable life, a life filled with meaning and value. As Viktor Frankl described it, we humans are meaning-centered beings. Our organ of meaning is our conscience. If we have dulled this and find no meaning in life, a mental hole develops, an existential frustration, as Frankl called it. Into this existential frustration then proliferates libido, hatred, self-destruction, and addictive behavior. We can heal the emptiness in our soul with the help of meaning. We must find our God in ourselves so that we do not have to run after and pay homage to a false God. But this is a big task, a process that will not succeed overnight. But that is exactly why we are here in this world, standing in this life, to grow inwardly and spiritually. Frankl describes existential frustration as a result of a lack of meaning in life. There is certainly a lot of that. However, conversely, so to speak, the inner certainty of having and pursuing a meaning in life is no guarantee of being free of existential frustration. At least that is my personal experience. I have never had a lack of meaning in my life, and therefore I always thought I was free from existential frustration. Now, just in the course of my struggles in the writing process of this project, I have personally come in touch once again with my very deep-seated own lack of self-esteem. In a later post, I will write again about what the reasons for this may be. But this lack of self-esteem sits in every fiber of my being, saturates my ego and my perception of the world, and creates a chronic existential frustration. Not from a lack of meaning, but from the lack of self-worth, from which I suffer permanently and internally. And into this existential frustration, an excessive libido proliferates, to take up Frankel's formulation. In my case, I often feel very quickly attracted to the sexual charms of other women, even complete strangers on the street, and I'm drawn into their spell. This is a trigger that is often very quickly and uncontrollably simply there. Well, I always thought that this was normal, that it was just biologically laid out in men. However, what is interesting is that I'm currently working with positive affirmations to positively influence my self-esteem, to water and nourish it on a daily basis. Now, I have discovered that in what I have described as a moment of trigger sexual attraction, I can work with my self-worth. When I try to focus back on myself and give positive nourishment to my self-worth with the help of my affirmations, this trigger-like sexual fixation dissolves a very good bit. This is a real self-knowledge for me, and has also made clear to me on this level how pronounced my own lack of self-esteem is, and how this affects my life, even my biology. That's just as a little digression on the side. To come back again from the great spiritual level of the central role of a meaning of life to an almost banal one, we should not disregard the small ripples on the surface of the water to understand the overall picture. A part of the increase for this striving for fame today's almost popular sport are the very unstable social conditions, the precariat of wide parts of the population within the rich Western states. In view of the increasing impossibility of working one's way out of precarious life situations with diligence and honest work, many choose the flight towards, so to speak. This consists of the often desperate attempt to secure one's own existence by trying to become famous. No matter what the cost, no matter what I do, the main thing is that I generate enough attention. Actually, a rather absurd undertaking, but this phenomenon is reflected in the brutal cutthroat competition within our economy of attention. Moving through the various platforms and so-called social media, one discovers a huge amount of so-called content and people who, with the help of the most absurd things, strategies and content, reach an international niche audience and generate a considerable amount of followers. Young people see this and think, well, I can do that too, and get on this merry-go-round as well. A futile endeavor, a great distraction and spiritual aberration. Everyone should find their own spiritual path, that's clear, but we also have to create space for that. And that is why I recommend you once again to detach and free yourself as much as possible from the usual media consumption. I'm convinced that the consumption of this everyday noise may be harmless taken individually, but in the form in which it occupies our brain, completely takes over and leaves us no room for introspection, represents a damage that should not be underestimated. This noise occupies us, clouds our clear thinking, and undermines our urge and ability to change. We get stuck in the status quo, which makes us increasingly unhappy. Don't do this because you are worth it. I couldn't resist reinterpreting this well-known advertising slogan now. I think I have something to say because of my imprints, my traits, which are diametrically opposed to this rather conservative imprint in proportion. I'm a very specific life experience in very different contexts, in different countries and continents. Even more important than all these personal parameters added together, I think that I have succeeded in opening a channel to intuition within me. That is, my specific own, coupled with an inspiration from outside that is more intelligent and wiser than I am. But this also means that I partly give intelligent ideas for myself, which are just more intelligent than myself. And it should be clear to everyone that as a human being, there's often a big gap between one's own ideal ideas and the lived reality itself. How far this is true for myself, you would only have to ask my wife. Postulating the necessity of communality at one's own eye level, of collective action in mutual respect and freedom, and the increase of love is of course far from being the same as the ability to implement and live this out on oneself. In other words, think about what I have said, put it on the scale for yourself. Perhaps you can make some of these ideas fruitful for yourself in your life, but do not trust me as a person. I'm just as weak, flawed, blinded, and mentally deformed by a lack of self-worth as others. There is a book of a famous educational author who contributed an important standard work on modern education. Decades after the publication of this book, her son wrote an autobiography which shows that this author not only did not apply all these pedagogical principles she postulated in the education of her own children, but practiced the exact opposite of them. Of course, this is personally tragic for herself and especially for her own children. And I also understand that the son, perhaps in the public exaggerated image of this person, wanted to clarify. And he may be right that perhaps too much honor of the person was given to this author. Only, it's just not about the person. Just because this woman was apparently not able, for whatever reason, to apply the principles she postulated herself, this says first of all nothing about the value of her ideas as such. One has to deal with the ideas, and of course one has to see how they can be translated into reality. If it turns out that these ideas are wrong or unrealistic and they cannot be implemented in anyone's case, that is of course something else. But the individual case, and be it the author herself, says first of all still nothing at all. Even more, it could have been that her personal suffering from the gap between reality and her own claim enabled her to recognize and formulate these principles in all their clarity. That is, I'm only advocating that people engage with my ideas, examine them, perhaps disagree with them, expand on them, and consider the applicability of these ideas to themselves. It should not be about whether I myself am now a great exceptional person or just the opposite. However, if I were to present myself at any point, even to the outside world, as if I were not only someone who might have extraordinary ideas, but who was also personally extraordinary, better than others, then you should become skeptical. Especially if I would derive a special claim to leadership from this displayed exceptionality. But this is exactly what often happens imperceptibly and very quickly. Namely that people who become successful with Something suddenly have loud admirers and yes men around them, and their ego then inflates. These people, sometimes not even necessarily intended by themselves, are given symbolic power by other people and admirers. And this kind of power can also corrupt incredibly easily. No one is immune to this, including myself, of course, and precisely because I myself carry around a very ordinary or perhaps even an extraordinary high level of lack of self-worth. And therefore, I myself am very susceptible to praise and admiration, applause and all the things that fill up this inner lack from the outside. However, I'm striving to heal this lack at its root and within myself, especially in my turning to the source of all that is valuable, which is the divine itself. This, however, is a process, and one that may be a lengthy one, but one that is worthwhile. I sit in the sun and observe how, out of the side valley, a few kilometers away, a heavy downpour pours from the clouds. My impulse is to immediately pack my things and go inside before the rain gets to me. I look up and over me and see no clouds. Maybe I will be spared at this point. The curtain of rain moves towards the sea and indeed does not seem to arrive here. Again and again, the dark blue, olive green to bright turquoise shining color layers in the sea change and shift. When I again direct my gaze to the sea, suddenly a few very dark spots, clearly delineated, stand out. I wonder if this could be due to rearrangement of the water masses, or if it is rather related to the shadows cast by the clouds. I get up and try to find out the reason. It becomes clear to me that the upheavals of water masses from the depth cannot happen so fast. Reflections of surface phenomena, however, can. The interplay of these natural phenomena makes for the charming interplay of colors. Before it's time to take a short break and brew myself another coffee, I decide to treat myself to a refreshing shower. Tullio has a garden shower artfully inserted into the rock and overgrown by trees and shrubs. What a pleasure to feel the cooling water running along my skin. Living water caresses my body and frees my mind. Outside, on the very horizon of the sea to the north, a strange sight presents itself to me. A beautiful, not very long, but wide and powerful rainbow reaches from the very edge of the sea. There were people thought at some point that the world would end and the world disk would break off. From there to the clouds, this rainbow reaches. Over the whole sea, thick, dark clouds. Only on the left of the rainbow, thus a piece west of it, likewise completely far out, is a large, silvery, brightly shining light cone. In the center of this cone, a huge cargo ship, very slowly heading towards this rainbow. This beautiful, magical sight is interrupted by my thoughts. It goes through my mind that I once read somewhere that only 20 of these large cargo ships in the world emit more harmful greenhouse gases than the worldwide passenger car traffic. I watch the rainbow and this chiaroscuro, the strong contrast between the very dark clouds and the bright cone of light. Suddenly, the floodgates of a thick rain cloud open over the sea, very close to me. I'm already ready to take flight again, but still remain tensely in the same place. I hear the rain pattering on the surface of the water. The rain roughens the sea and dips it into a dark blue-gray color at the spot. This rain cloud and the large round black field below it, which looks like the shadow from the spaceship of Independence Day, has positioned itself menacingly. Only a few hundred meters in front of me is this clearly delineated area, and now but does not move from the spot. As in a stalemate situation, a hold this field from me, it moves neither forward nor back. Suddenly, the other end of the rainbow forms and stretches the bow from one end at the open sea to the other one up to the coast. There at the place, approximately with the small place Città del Mare Perla del Golfo. In all these interplays, nature surprises me here every day anew. In the last few days, perhaps for research purposes, but also because I'm always fascinated by this topic, I have been watching film footage of contemporary witnesses from the inner circle around Adolf Hitler. They talk about their everyday life on the Berghof or in Berlin and describe the characters and behaviors of the people from the center of power. The banal normality and average ordinariness of these people, this vacuum, creates a peculiar pull. You can't get a grip on the evil. It slips between your fingers. For example, when Goebbels' mistress raves about his charm and engaging sense of humor. Hitler's domestic servants tell of a well-organized business and the balanced daily routine between state duties, meals, outings, and evening entertainment. Where is the evil? Where is the contempt for humanity, all the hatred, the desire to murder, the will to dominate the world and drag it out to ruin? Nowhere. Nowhere in the character of the leadership, except for the conspicuousness of a tight hierarchy, a great ambition of some, an absolute obedience to the leader, but rather submissive and model students than beasts of evil, than servants of the devil. The hatred does not show itself in secret, but unrestrained and bluntly only where everybody got to see it. In the inflammatory speeches of Hitler, the propaganda minister, and the other epigones of the performance art of the Führer. The striving for power arises from a deep-seated lack, but seizing power, using it for one's own purpose, exploiting it and ultimately abusing it is a creeping process to which virtually everyone succumbs to varying degrees. The drunkenness of power distorts one's perspective, and above all, it hampers one's ability for self-reflection. Power creeps imperceptibly into the subconscious like a nerve poison, numbs one's consciousness, and imperceptibly corrupts the powerful. Also, by distancing oneself from the effects of one's actions, empathy for the real consequences of one's decisions is mostly lacking. In fact, a lack of empathy is virtually the basic prerequisite to aspire to and then accept and fill a position of power, or as these people perceive it from their perspective, to take responsibility. Which means, for example, having to make uncomfortable decisions when necessary. For example, when a CEO has to lay off workers to increase profits for the company. In Hitler's case, the only thing that stands out is that he's lack of empathy must have been particularly pronounced, and his Nietzschean, Nietzsche-style will to power was extremely strong from the start. He rejected any kind of weighing things up or showing a democratic willingness to compromise as total weakness, and presented the ruthless striving for power as strength and virtue. From the very beginning, even when he himself had no power at all. This also means, by extension, that wiping out the opponent who obstructs the seizure of power is only a logical consequence. But if one looks at the many illegal wars of the USA, the ruthless imperial policy, the one sees also in this case that it needs only little justification to abuse the own power on the most brutal. Namely, in the case of the USA, their banal justification is their propagated exceptionalism and the so-called protection of the national interest justified thereby. There, as collateral damage, hundreds of thousands of dead civilians are accepted without batting an eye. This is radically evil, and if one applied the standard of international law, all US presidents of the last decades would have to be accused of as war criminals. I write all this to sensitize my readers to the fact that power inevitably corrupts. There may be an extremely small number of people who may be immune to this, but the exceptions prove the rule. And it is for this reason, for no other reason, this perennial farce in human history that we have developed and painstakingly won our democratic checks and balances. However, for us, for those who do not possess power, this is an abstract problem. We cannot imagine this. We do not understand this, and we mistakenly apply our everyday yardstick when it comes to the personal judgment of powerful people. But this is a category mistake, because this is not the point whether this person is rather likable or not, whether Mr. Goebbels may have been charming in private dealings and Hitler a nice uncle. Those who hold uncontrolled power in their hands will abuse it. And of course, this does not only apply to the sphere of the political, but also to the economic. People who accumulate too much economic power will abuse that power, and therefore we have to contain power, always with the help of democratic and collective methods, in order to be able to secure the common good. This is exactly the main problem of our current economic system and why it has this huge destructive power. Because economic power is concentrated in fewer and fewer hands and is becoming more and more unequal, more and more bizarre. If we want to get to the root of our systemic problems, we must solve the power problem. How? By simply taking it into our own hands and developing and applying completely different rules of the game. This is not easy. This is no easy task, because we are all, to a greater or lesser extent, woven into the system and have somehow come to terms with the reality of the status quo. But the problem is that the status quo only ensures apparent stability and security, but in reality it is slowly but surely heading for collapse. Because the gap between rich and poor is getting wider and wider, the middle class is being destroyed peu à peu by the superiority of the platform corporations. Our planet is being mercilessly exploited and power is concentrating more and more at the top. And precisely because this tendency which precisely does not mean the preservation of the status quo, but rather drives an economic and cultural decline, is coming under more and more pressure on the straits. The thumb screws of state control are being tightened. This can be seen very well in the corona crisis, where the fundamental rights to free expression and the right to demonstrate are being curtailed under the pretext of the virus. In the wake of the measures, demonstrations and the media-produced rejection of them by large parts of the population, a law has just been passed in England that permanently restricts the right to civil disobedience on a massive scale. This is already being prevented because the protests will increase massively in the future, even after the pandemic, due to the successive collapse of the system. It is high time to leave the sinking Titanic. It makes no sense to fight the system. We should simply leave the system and develop and implement new collective systems. Every initiative, no matter how small, is valuable and has the potential to become a game changer. Do what you can in your field. Start a local currency, collectively farm a vegetable field, open a coffee house as a cooperative, art projects that bring people together, a shopping refusal festival, a demonstration of underpaid caregivers, whatever. Everyone can bring new ideas to the place where he or she is. Alright, so this was the 9th episode, or no, the 8th episode. And I'm going to check out if somebody wants to write a comment. You can write in the chat section if you do have something to say, and I try to give you an answer. Of course, you can also write afterwards, and I'm going to give you an answer, a written answer in the chat section. All right, so this is it for today, and I'm going to see you next week on Wednesday afternoon.